All right, guys, we just had an exciting chapter, right? Aslan and the two girls, Lucy and Susan, on his back, flew over the wall into the witch's castle, and they just landed. Here's what happens next. What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people, too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. Now, do you remember where all those animals came from? They weren't carved out of stone, right? They were turned into stone. They were beautiful creatures from Narnia, and they were turned into stone because they were not helping the witch. They were the good guys. And so Susan says, hush, Aslan's doing something. He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and breathed on him. Do you remember that lion when Edmund went to the castle? And he got close to that lion. He thought, oh, it must be Aslan. No, it wasn't. So Aslan breathed on the lion. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around almost as if he'd been a cat chasing his tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, and turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed to two centaurs. But at the moment, Lucy said, oh, Susan, look at the lion. So here's Aslan. He comes in and he breathes on the lion. Then he turns to the rabbit. Then he turns to the centaurs. So he's going all around the statues. And then Susan says, Lucy says, Susan, look at the lion. I expect you've seen someone put a light to a match to a piece of newspaper. Have you ever seen that? Like just to the edge of a paper? Which has been propped up against a grate and unlit. And then for a second, nothing seems to happen. And then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. So he's saying, do you remember taking a piece of paper and you see just the edge burn? Like you've ever seen your mom or dad start a fire in your fireplace or the fire pit? And the paper doesn't just go poosh. It starts with just a little edge and it starts to creep that way. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him as a flame licks all over the piece of paper. Then his hindquarters were still obviously stone, but the lion shook his mane and all the heavy stone the folds rippled into living hair. What? The stone just rippled into living hair. Then he opened his great mouth with a warm and living and gave a prodigious yawn. Could you imagine? You've been a stone lion all this time, and then you're finally awakened by Aslan, and you go, oh, yawn. And now his hind leg had come to life as well. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisked around with him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. So they were friends, weren't they? Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo, because there were so many creatures. The courtyard looked like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing all around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white in the courtyard, it was now a blaze of color. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs and indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, red and brown foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs. Think how cute those dwarfs were with those little red hoods, right? And the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh, transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow, And instead of the deadly silence that the whole place rang with, the sound of happy, roaring, braying, yelping, barking, squealing, cooing, neighing, stamping, shouts, hoorays, songs, and laughter. Ha! What a joyous place. Oh, said Susan in a different tone, look, I wonder, is it safe? Lucy looked and saw that Aslan had just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. Uh-oh. It's all right, shouted Aslan. Once the feet are put right, all of the rest of him will follow. That wasn't exactly what I meant, whispered Susan to Lucy. So Aslan thinks they're worried, like, is the giant going to come back to life? And Susan was worried that the giant was going to come back to life, because he's a giant. But it was too late to do anything about it, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted his club off his shoulders, rubbing his eyes, and said, "This is not what I would expect. Bless me, I must have been asleep." Could you imagine this big, huge giant that Susan was afraid of? Just going, "Oh, bless me, I must have been asleep." Just like the lion came back to life and just yawned. Oh. Where's that drat little witch that was running about on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was. But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what really happened, and when the giant had put his hand to his ear and got them to repeat it all again so that was the last he understood, then he bowed down his head and was no further off than the top of the haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan, beaming all over his honest, ugly face. Giants of any sort are now so rare in England that few giants are good-tempered. And 10 to 1, have you ever met a giant when his face is beaming? It's a sight worth looking at. So the giant, he thought the last he remembered, the witch who was tiny to him was there. And so he woke up and he's like, "Where's that little witch?" And then all the creatures said, "The witch is the one who turned you to stone. You've been stone for years. And it's Aslan who brought you out." So he's like, tap, tap, "Hey, Aslan." "Now for the inside of the house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone. Upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched." So he's like, "Everyone go out. Find all the statues because I'm going to bring them all to life. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fusty old castle echoed with the opening of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor kangaroo! Call Aslan!" Oh my goodness, could you imagine? It's like, "Call Aslan, there's a kangaroo over here. Oh, open the window over here. Don't forget that stairway." Oh my goodness, so funny. But the best of all is when Lucy came rushing upstairs shouting out, "Aslan, Aslan, I found Mr. Tumnus. Yay! Oh, do come quickly." A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding each other by both hands and dancing around the room for joy. The little chap was none the worse for having been a statue, and was, of course, very interested in all she had to tell him. So sweet Mr. Tumnus was brought back, and they were holding both hands and just dancing around. We call it the happy dance in our family, where we just dance around like that. When good things happen, it's good to do the happy dance. But at the last ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended, but when at last it was ended, the whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so very badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, I think it was Tumnus, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had gotten in by way of a big jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then, rising on his hind legs, he bawled up to the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" All right, this is the giant. "Giant Rumblebuffin, if you please, your honor," said the giant once more, touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor. It will be a pleasure," said the giant. "Stand well away from the gates, all of you little uns." Then he strode to the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shivered at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and the waving trees and the sparkling streams of the forest and the blue hills beyond them, and beyond them the sky. So here they were, standing in this dark, dingy castle where they'd been trapped and turned into statues, and the big giant Rumblebuffin knocked down the walls, and they could all just walk out. But they could see out there the beauty of Narnia. They could see everything as it was supposed to be, the way Aslan wanted it, right? The way Aslan was intended to be, or Narnia was intended to be. This is a hilarious statement. Are you ready? "Blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. All right, so he was puffing so hard because he was so big it was like a train. "Comes of being out of condition. I suppose neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about ya?" "Yes, I have," said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. So here she is reaching up. "I have a handkerchief." "Thank you, Missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. The next moment, Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself in midair between the giant's finger and thumb. So here she was, in between there. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly startled and realized that he had, he says, "Bless me, I've picked up the little girl instead of just the handkerchief." "I beg your pardon, Missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." You thought she was the handkerchief. "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the size to him that a saccharin tablet would be to you. So back then they used these little pills for sugar. Okay, so think of like tiny little pills. And so he wiped his little face with it, and then he said, "I'm afraid it's not much to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "Not at all, not at all," said the giant politely. "Never met a nicer handkerchief, so finely, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant who was, but an old family with traditions, you know. If he'd be the other sort, he would have never been turned into stone." So if he was a bad giant, he wouldn't be turned into stone. They're on their way. They have a big adventure to come, and you'll hear about that next time.